Welcome to the You on the Camino de Santiago podcast. This podcast is for and about first-time pilgrims walking the pilgrimage routes in Spain, France, and Portugal. With your host, guide and longtime pilgrim, Nancy Reynolds of the Camino Experience. Hola pilgrims, Nancy here, back this week to share with you updates and thoughts from the Camino Frances from my May 2025 trip. In case you don't know, I am on the Camino Frances every May and September because that's when I lead my Camino Experience groups from Saint-Jean-Pied-du-Port to Pamplona. This May, I had a group of 11 fabulous pilgrims, all of whom were walking from Saint-Jean for the first time. Before I met up with my group, I did my own little 6-day walk from Nájera to Burgos, which is one of my favorite sections to walk in the spring. And before that, I was in Santiago for 2 days visiting a friend. I happened to be in Santiago during the countrywide power outage. Did you hear about that? What a trip that was. We lost power around noon on Monday, and it came back on around 3:15 the next morning. Now, when the power goes out at home, usually we can go online and check the power company's website for updates or call their hotline. But I don't know how to do that in Spain. And in any event, without power, we didn't have Wi-Fi, of course. And for some reason, our cell phone data connections weren't working. So we were a bit stuck. Then we heard from a neighbor who had a radio that the power was out in 4 countries, and that started our conspiracy theorizing. I admit it was a bit unnerving to not know what was happening and why, but I was lucky to be with a friend who knew people in the city, so we were able to get food and connect with others. What would you have done if you were in Spain during this crazy power outage? Well, you would do what we did and what pilgrims all along the Camino did. You would come together with other pilgrims, pool your resources, and enjoy being together as best you can. I will say it was a good reminder to always have some cash euros on hand, as ATMs and point-of-sale terminals in shops were not available without power. Do you know the word for cash in Spanish? It's efectivo. Efectivo. Okay, that was the start of my time in Spain, but we have so much more to talk about, so let's get to it. This episode and the next are going to cover a lot of ground, and it may seem a bit non-linear, so I invite you to get comfortable, or to get on your walking shoes and head out for a walk, or maybe just grab a pen and paper to capture some of these tips. By the way, I had intended to make this one long episode, but I was at an event on Sunday where I did a lot of yelling and cheering, and I nearly lost my voice. So I am going to push out half of this week and then finish it up next week. I will also tell you about the event I went to in next week's episode because it has a lot to do with coming home from the Camino. When I'm on the Camino, I think about this podcast a lot. I think about all the things I want to share with you, all the questions first-time pilgrims ask, some of which that can only be answered by getting yourself to your starting point and taking your first steps. And I think about how to help you prepare without over-preparing and plan without over-planning. I do love the element of surprise on the Camino, though, so I want to protect that and encourage you to see the journey as one of discovery and exploration. But I also know you need some practical information and a way to calm those nerves as you get ready for this totally into the unknown experience. So let me give you a preview of what I'm going to talk about in this episode and the next. In this episode, I'm going to answer a handful of first-time pilgrim questions that are showing up nonstop on social media. Questions like, how hard is it, really? Do you have to train? What's the weather going to be like? Do I need a sleeping bag? do I need to reserve a bed or room in advance? Then next week, I'll finish up with the updates from the trail by sharing some on-the-ground tips, things like where to get gear, where to get the best pizza on the Frances route, which is very important, and how to prepare for your return home. Plus, I'll include a few other miscellaneous things like the new system of registering your personal information online and also an update to the luggage transport services. As I said, I'm just back from time on the Frances route, so that is what I will be talking about. But some of what I share is applicable to all routes, so stay with me. Before we jump into all of that, I want to circle back and give a shout out to my May 2025 Camino Experience group and to some of my listeners who I met on the trail. I'll start with my listeners. So shout out to Savannah from Australia, who I met at Refuge Horizon. We shared one of the 6-bed dorm rooms and got to have some fun chats about her Camino and also about her dad, who had already walked the Camino and had inspired her to walk it. So shout out to Dad, too, who is also a loyal listener. And then I met Ingrid and her husband. Sorry, I didn't get his name or where they're from, but I love this. Ingrid used the podcast to plan their Camino, and it sounded like her husband was a little tired of me. And Ingrid's ongoing refrain of, Nancy says, way to go, Ingrid. I love that you trusted me and my experience on the Camino Frances. And it keeps me humble to know that I do get on some people's nerves. Speaking of nerves, you may remember Jarrett and Amy from episode 109. They shared that their kids were getting a bit tired of me when they made them listen to the podcast on a 6 or so hour road trip. Sorry, kids. I had the pleasure of meeting up with Jarrett and Amy in Pamplona, where we shared pinchos and conversation, and then again a few days down the trail in Santa Catalina de Somoza. Now, if you know the Camino Frances, you may be wondering how we worked out a meetup at 2 locations, 550 kilometers apart, within the span of a week. That happened because we all jumped ahead after Pamplona. Jarrett and Amy had planned to walk as far as Pamplona, then take the train to León and continue from there. They planned their Camino this way due to time constraints. I, on the other hand, had picked up a rental car in Pamplona after finishing with my May group and had driven west to visit some of my favorite spots, to do a bit of research on the current state of things on the Camino, and to shoot some video for future projects. Things go pretty fast when you're in a car on the Camino, by the way. It's a bit of a shock to the system after walking for a time, but it's so satisfying for this girl who loves road trips. When I met up with Jarrett and Amy in Santa Catalina, I also randomly met another listener who was staying at the same guest house, so shout out to Terry from Canada. That was so fun to share in everyone's enthusiasm and to hear firsthand what a difference this podcast is making for those of you getting ready to walk the Camino for the first time. It's also fun for me when pilgrims quote something I said on the podcast and then tell me exactly when and where they experienced it on the trail. My favorite this time was Jarrett and Amy's story of taking a taxi to skip the crazy, evil descent into the Biri. They had learned about that here, and they talked to someone on the trail who was completely incredulous. They said, I didn't know that was an option. That brings up the all-important question of if it's okay to skip parts of the trail, if it's okay to get a bus or taxi simply because you don't want to walk a certain part. Spoiler alert, yes, it's okay. There are no rules except for the ones you set for yourself, and of course the church's guidelines to receive the Compostela. The current guidelines are that you must walk 100 continuous kilometers on your chosen route, 75 of those kilometers must be inside Spain, and you need to walk the final stretch into Santiago. Still, if you are planning to take a taxi or bus to skip ahead, I recommend you think it through before you do it. My goal is no regrets. Now let me get to my May 2025 Camino Experience group and give a shout out to Andre, Allison, Natalie, Ken, Stephanie, Jody, Bill, Judy, Carla, Kai, and Donna. You are all Pilgrim rock stars, and it was absolutely my honor and pleasure to share in your Camino journey. They are all now spread out along the Frances route, moving ahead through the joys and challenges of a pilgrimage journey. What can I say about this group? They really came together in the most uplifting and supportive way to encourage each other and truly share the journey. They walk together and alone, as all my groups do, with each person finding their rhythm and pace. And now some are still together, and some are on their own, and 3 have gone home due to injuries or other physical challenges. Now that's notable, isn't it, that 3 have gone home? Here's what I find interesting. The Pilgrim's Office in Santiago collects statistics on how many pilgrims received the Compostela, and the Pilgrim's Office in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port collects statistics on how many pilgrims start there. But there's no reliable data on what happens in between. No data on who walks alone, who finds a Camino family and who doesn't, who starts and ends with a group, which alternative routes pilgrims take along the way, who stops before they reach Santiago and where they stop, and, more interestingly, why they stop. I believe we need to tell these stories. When you watch YouTube videos and movies about the Camino, most of them show pilgrims reaching Santiago and triumphantly arriving in the plaza in front of the cathedral. But that's not the whole story. I wonder what percentage of pilgrims don't make it to the cathedral. Of course, there are many pilgrims who don't intend to reach Santiago. But what about those who do intend to reach Santiago but don't make it? How many come back another time to finish the journey? How many return home emotionally and physically wrecked? How many simply realize it's not for them, so they change their plans and go tour Rome or party in Ibiza? There are as many stories as there are pilgrims. If you have one of these stories, I'll call them alternative endings to your pilgrimage, I would love to hear from you, and I would love to have you as a guest on the podcast. If you're interested, drop me an email at nancy@thecaminoexperience.com or find the link in the show notes to let me know you'd like to share your story here. Okay, back to my May trip. Every time I lead a group, I learn new things about myself and about the Camino. I think I become a better person, maybe, and I even become a better pilgrim. Well, sort of. I still pack too much, and my luggage is still too heavy. But I guess that must be my cross to bear because it keeps happening. Thank goodness for the luggage transport services. Okay, I did learn to travel light way back during my first 7 or so years on the Camino, when I always carried my backpack. That was back when I didn't have the budget to pay for luggage transport, and honestly, luggage transport wasn't that popular back then. Now, I know you know that I'm a firm believer in doing the Camino your way. But I will say that the lessons learned from carrying your backpack, from carrying everything you need, and being fully self-contained for the month or so you are on the Camino, those lessons are priceless and life-changing. Highly recommended. I am going to have some guests on the podcast this summer who have done just that, so hopefully we will get an up-close look at what that adds to the Camino experience. All right, let's go ahead and get to the meat of this episode. As I said, I'm going to start by answering a handful of first-time pilgrim questions that are showing up nonstop on social media. And then next week, we'll get to the updates from the trail and some on-the-ground tips. Here we go. First question, for those starting in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, how hard is it going over the Pyrenees? Really? Well, it depends. It depends on how fit you are, on how much weight you are carrying, both on your body and on your back, how tired and jet-lagged you are, what the weather's like, and how beholden you are to your expectations. From a physical perspective, the more fit you are, the easier it will be. The more weight you are carrying, the harder it will be. If you are tired and jet-lagged, it's harder both physically and mentally. If the weather is bad, meaning if it's cold, wet, or windy, or all three, it feels like the longest day ever. One thing first-time pilgrims usually don't know how to plan for is how long it's going to take to make the walk from Saint-Jean-Pied-du-Port to Roncesvalles. This stage is approximately 25 kilometers, which on flat ground may take you 5 to 6 or 7 hours to walk. But the walk over the Pyrenees is quite steep in places, both going up and going down. And for much of that walk, it is relentlessly uphill. That means you'll be moving more slowly and the walk will take longer. My groups always stop and stay the night at Refuge Orison, which is just under 8 kilometers from Saint-Jean-Pied-du-Port. The fastest pilgrims in my group complete this stage in 2 to 2.5 hours. The slowest take 4 to 5 hours. The difference comes down to fitness, pack weight, and how prepared they are physically. Neither is better. Neither is the right amount of time, but the experiences are different. Now I'm going to tell you the most important piece of information about how long it takes to walk this stage. If it takes you 4 to 5 hours to get to Refuge Orison, take note. That first part to Orison is less than 1/3 of the total distance from Saint-Jean to Roncesvalles, which means it's going to take you up to 8 to 10 hours to get from Orison to Roncesvalles. I will tell you what I tell my groups. For some of you, the walk over the Pyrenees is going to be harder than expected. And for some of you, it will be easier than expected. That is what to expect. That is what you want to be prepared for mentally. Can you do it? Yes, you can, especially if you're not doing it alone and you have the encouragement from other pilgrims. So if you are not starting the Camino with a group, make friends with other pilgrims. Talk to strangers and connect and support each other in getting over the mountain. That brings us to the next question. Do you have to train to walk the Camino? Do you have to? No. But you are going to have a much easier time if you do. For me, the question isn't, do you have to train, but how do you train? You need 3 things to make it over the Pyrenees: cardiovascular health, muscles in your legs, and time on your feet. You get cardiovascular health by working your heart, and you do that with exercise. Climbing hills and stairs, walking on a treadmill at an incline, running, riding a bike, swimming, rowing. There are lots of ways to get your heart rate up. You can build muscles in your legs by doing strength training, but the best way is to do what you will do on the Camino, walk up and down hills, or in the absence of hills, in case you live someplace flat, walking up and down stairs. And to get time on your feet so they become conditioned to the long days on the Camino, you need to walk in the shoes or boots you will wear on the Camino. You may be wondering, can't I just wait and do all this on the Camino? Can't I train on the trail? Yes, of course you can, but do be aware of the risks and how to mitigate them. If you haven't trained, you are going to take longer to get where you're going, especially when crossing the Pyrenees. In that case, it would be best to stop your first night at either Refuge Orison or Auberge Borda, and then to get an early start on day 2. If you haven't trained, or if you haven't trained with your backpack loaded up to its full weight, you run the risk of getting blisters or becoming injured. Take it slow, slow, slow. Plan for short days the first week while you get used to the rigors of walking each day. And take regular breaks throughout the day to sit down, take off your boots and socks, air out your feet, give them a massage, and put on a fresh pair of socks. Actually, I recommend that everyone do this last one, fit or not, trained or not. Trust me on this. I've been over these mountains 18 times, and I've seen it all many times. If you want to make it to Santiago, you first have to make it to Roncesvalles. These first couple of days are critical, and they set the tone for the rest of the journey. Now, I mentioned the weather and that the weather can influence how much you enjoy walking over the Pyrenees. So let's talk about the weather next. One of the most commonly asked questions on social media is, what's the weather going to be like? Let me just say, that's the wrong question to ask. Why? Because no one knows the answer. We can't know the answer. Yes, we can generalize and say that in general, April is cold and wet and you may have snow. May is less cold but still wet. June is lovely, but it's getting hotter. July and August are miserably hot. September is hot but cooling off. October is colder and it rains a lot. And November through March, which is considered off-season, is cold, wet, and miserable. But Mother Nature's in charge here, and the weather is wholly unpredictable. What are you really asking when you ask about the weather? I think what you want to know is, how do you get the best possible weather? You know, since you're going to be outside for 4 to 8 hours a day for a month or more. The thing is, no matter how you answer that question, no matter when you walk the Camino, you're likely going to get all kinds of weather. Hot, cold, wet, dry, windy, all of it. So the only things you can do are prepare yourself mentally and dress appropriately. And here's a pro tip from Andre, who is in my May Camino Experience group. Don't believe the weather apps. Do be prepared, but don't overreact. That's it, Andre. Instead of relying on the apps and panicking, simply look out the window and be prepared for whatever you see and get. Right on. The next frequently asked question is, do I need a sleeping bag? Here's the short answer. If you will be staying in the albergues in shared dorm rooms, you need something. That's for hygiene purposes, as they don't want thousands of people sleeping directly on the mattresses and against the blankets, which, by the way, are not washed frequently. If you sleep cold, you'll probably be happiest with a sleeping bag. If you sleep hot, you may be better off with a sleeping bag liner or sleep sack. Many of the albergues do provide blankets, with the notable exception of the albergue in Roncesvalles. No blankets there. If you go with a sleeping bag, get the most compact, lightest weight one you can afford. That's it. Next up, do I need to reserve a bed or room in advance? I always recommend reserving a bed or room for your first few nights on the Frances from Saint-Jean-Pied-du-Port to Pamplona, especially if you're starting in May or September or the week before or after Easter. Those are the busiest times of the year. Other than that, there's no way to know how busy it will be and if you need to reserve in advance until you are on the trail. There is this crazy phenomenon on the Camino. Someone posts from the trail on, say, Facebook, that it's super busy and alarmingly alerts everyone that they have to make reservations now or they will be without a bed. But that is a fact only on that day and only exactly where that pilgrim is. This is hard to grasp, but the villages, towns, and cities on the Camino are not equally populated with pilgrims on any given day. Town A could be packed, and Town B, 50 kilometers away, could be empty. Pilgrims spread out and bunch up in the towns along the way in inconsistent ways. It would be like saying that because a restaurant in Santa Rosa, California, for example, is packed, then all the restaurants in nearby Sebastopol must also be packed. Doesn't make sense, right? Here's the conclusion. If your idea of the perfect Camino experience is to walk until you feel tired and then find a bed, give it a try. You will know pretty quickly if it's going to work. And then if it's not, you can adapt and start to reserve your beds a day or so in advance. One caveat. If you are planning to stay in private rooms along the way, you may need to plan ahead a bit more. That's because there are fewer private rooms than dorm beds in the Camino towns and villages. But again, you can book your first few nights and then see how it looks once you get there. And keep in mind that if you're using Booking.com to find rooms, properties don't make their entire room inventories available on that platform. So be sure to cross-reference to the property's website or contact them directly to check availability. While we are on the topic of booking beds and rooms, here are 2 pro tips for finding places close to the Camino Trail. 1. Use the mapping feature in your favorite Camino app to see where places are located relative to the trail. The places listed in the apps have been chosen for their proximity to the Camino Trail. And 2, if you are considering staying at a place that's not listed in a Camino app, then use Google Maps to find it and to determine how close it is to something close to the Camino Trail. For example, you can see how close it is to one of the properties listed in your app that is close to the trail. Or you can locate the cathedral or main church in the city or town and see how close the property is to that. In general, you want to aim to be within 200 to 300 meters of the cathedral in the larger cities, or within 100 to 200 meters of the church in smaller towns. Okay, those are the things that are on the minds of many, if not most, first-time pilgrims, and that is where I'm going to wrap up this episode. I will be back next week with the updates from the trail and some thoughts on coming home. Catch you next week.